Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight, we are talking about Martin Scorsese's latest epic gangster movie, The Irishman. And yes, you may remember several lengthy jokes by me about not seeing it because it's too long, but I'm a phenomenal hypocrite. And relatedly, we will then be asking, what makes a good 3.5-hour film? But before we get into that, no doubt very, very long discussion, Alistair, what else have you been consuming in the last fortnight?
Well, I've been digging into the legacy of another 70s Hollywood icon. However, this time it's not a director, it's a specific film. One of my absolute favourite films. So I watched a new-ish documentary called Memory, The Origins of Alien, about the film Alien. More specifically, it's about the character of the alien itself and the look and sort of feel and visual identity of the film and how that evolved. It focuses a lot on Carlo Romaldi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who was the special effects supervisor in the film, who came up with the look and feel of the alien. It's really interesting how it sort of traces as the title of the documentary says, it traces the origins of Alien and the concepts, tracing it all back to like how it's rooted in ideas of Greek and Egyptian mythologies. Also brings in like various films and other works that had, other works of cinema and things that influenced the film before it came out. It digs a lot into like the art and the sort of visual identity of the film and like artistic influences, which kind of really nicely linked up my interests of cinema, science fiction, and the visual arts. It talks a lot about like H.R. Geiger and his influence on the film, like the design of the film, not just the alien, but like the other ships and the character, the navigator, things like that. It talks a lot about Francis Bacon and his influence on the film, which is interesting because perhaps not as well known as Geiger's influence on Alien. Talks a lot about like the politics of the film, the gender politics of the film, which is very interesting, but also the class politics of the film as well. The other thing that's really interesting about it is they have interviews with people involved, including some cast members, but either deliberately or not deliberately, but it really works, is there's not anyone particularly famous in the film. They don't interview Ridley Scott. I don't think they interview Sigourney Weaver, John Hurt, Ian Holm. Like the big names from the film aren't interviewed, but some of the supporting people are. I think not having a big star in it would like just overshadow the main star of the film, which is the look of the film, but also Carlo Romaldi and his exceptional work. If you're a fan of the film, this is a must-see. If you're just generally interested, actually, it's a really well put together, very well done documentary, actually, so yeah.
Well, yeah, I think if you get into sort of cast members' personal anecdotes, then thanks to the magic of the clickbait internet, it just immediately becomes about that, doesn't it? The headline just immediately becomes, In a new documentary, John Hurt confirms he shat his pants on set. Or words to that effect.
Yeah, that said, I think I tell a lie. There are some, I think they do have a few, because Carlo Romaldi had died before this film, and so had Giger died quite a while ago, and Francis Bacon died quite a while ago, and obviously John Hurt died more recently. So there are some interviews, I think, certainly with Giger and Bacon and Romaldi, but they're older interviews and they're kind of shown on TV screens, which is clever because it shows that they're sort of in the past. It also helpfully corrects the fact they're probably at a lower definition than the digital media used to shoot the film on. I think there is some stuff with John Hurt as well, but only a little bit really. And it really does allow the substance of the film to show through. But as is always a risk with these documentary stuff, they deliberately avoided anything that could just basically get sliced and then just in a little bit can just be thrown up to YouTube and people watch that instead of watching the whole thing.
Well, I think that's always going to be, a risk, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how you'd exactly go about avoiding that.
Well, an interesting case in point is another sort of documentary about digging into the origin of a thing recently is a documentary called Oxide Ghosts about the making of Brass Eye. Famously, the guy who's showing the film, he's not allowed it to go on any streaming platforms on the internet because he knows as soon as it gets uploaded anywhere, they're just going to cut out the little bits of Brass Eye sketches that didn't make into the TV show, and then those will just go out on YouTube, and that will be the thing. He's made a decision. If you want to see Oxide Ghosts, you have to go see it at an actual screening, because if he releases on DVD or puts it out any other way, it will inevitably just be sliced up and the thing as a whole will be lost. And I really respect him for that, because this film, Oxide Ghost, probably would be a bigger hit and more well-known if he was an easier film to get hold of, but he's decided to protect his artistic integrity at the film and his own expense, and you got to respect that as a decision.
Yeah, it's true, even though I, am a very lazy person, will probably now never see that documentary, and there is a part of me that feels a bit about that, but I can also respect it.
Yeah, but Memory Origins of Alien is available on DVD. If you're interested in the film, I really recommend seeing it, and if you're interested in film in general, I recommend seeing it because it's very interesting. Anyway, Nick, what have you been up to recently?
Well, I've been spooling through large amounts of digital comics I bought on the Black Friday sales, because I get a lot of my comics through Comixology sales as it is, and obviously I feel like Black Friday has become a bit less of a thing in the last year or two, which to be honest is probably for the best, as all those videos of shoppers killing each other were just depressing. But there are still a reliable amount of cheap comics to be had on Comixology, so I do still get involved with those. So yeah, I've been reading Secret Six, a comic by Gail Simone and a few artists, I think mostly Nicola Scott, Dale Eaglesham and Jay Calafiore, and it's a DC series about a group of supervillains, mostly at a medium to high level of obscurity, but I think there's usually at least one or two famous ones in any given incarnation who sort of get together to form this sort of mercenary unit to try and just, get on with their lives and do their sort of dirty wet work jobs and try and stay out the way of both the superheroes and the crazy supervillains who want to destroy the world. These are just, guys who are a bit mentally unstable and good at fighting, who just want to earn an honest living, and or can't go anywhere else because they're too insane. So yeah, it's a fun series. It has a sort of nice sort of classic superhero vibe combined with this slightly weird edge to it, because the characters are fairly morally flexible and also often fairly strange, so they are often prone to doing sudden or violent things and then going back to being very likeable. They're very likeable supervillains. Gail Simone has chosen mostly villains who aren't known for being gigantic homicidal serial killers. The Joker is not really involved. They have an encounter with Lex Luthor earlier on, which they don't really like Lex Luthor because he's obviously a high scale nutcase. It's an interesting story. I enjoy, the workaday life of small scale supervillains is always a fun thing to get into in comics. I think Secret Six is probably one of the best comics to dig into that.
Yeah, you mentioned the Joker. This reminds me a bit of Suicide Squad, which I've not read the comics, so I've seen the quite bad film. But what reminds me about him is basically taking the idea of established villains and sort of recasting them as protagonists, not necessarily heroes, but seeing stories from their point of view.
Yeah, it's kind of Suicide Squad-y, but obviously Suicide Squad's primary angle, apart from being about villains, is the whole they're being coerced by the military, bombs in their heads thing, whereas Secret Six has a sort of team of mercenaries, found family vibe going on. Yeah. It's obviously a very dysfunctional found family because they're all quite dangerous people, but they're going for a sort of askew version of that found family vibe that we all love in our genre shows.
Yeah, so somewhere between Suicide Squad and Firefly.
Something like that, yeah. It is like a slightly more murdery Firefly. It's like Firefly, except, in Firefly, if they came to Mal Reynolds and said, we want to kidnap someone, and then threaten them, and if they don't do the thing, you have to actually kill them, Mal Reynolds would probably say, we'll pass, thanks. Whereas Secret Six would probably do it.
I think actually Firefly, the more I think about it, is the most apt comparison, because yeah, Firefly also, they are supposed to be bad guys stroke lovable rogues in that what they do is they do steal, they rob banks, they rob trains, things like that. There is a sort of sense that like they're outlaws, they're not necessarily whiter than white good guys, and also characters like your book have a dark past. So, but also they're not trying to supervillains destroy the world, they're just trying to make a living being outlaws, I suppose. So yeah, that seems like an apt comparison.
It's fairly apt, as I say. Secret Six are, I think, willing to go a bit harder on the doing things that are actually wrong than Firefly, I think, was. Firefly usually had the touching moments where they weren't willing to do that job, whereas Secret Six, there's a storyline where they meet some slavers, where they do, their moral sense does kick in a bit. But short of slavery, they're willing to do some quite grim shit.
Yeah, I think it's important if you're doing an outlaws stroke lovable rogue story to establish where the line is, unless you're deliberately doing some kind of story where it's like there's nothing these guys won't do. But yeah, if they're a sort of a rogues gallery, then yeah, it's important to establish where the line is.
And yeah, the characters themselves are mostly sort of quite low obscure characters because they're the ones you can get away with doing this sort of towing the moral line stuff with. As I say, you couldn't really do it with Lex Luthor or the Joker, and a lot of the big iconic villains tend to be the ones who are like incredibly evil, whereas the main characters in Secret Six are people like Catman, Actually, there's dead shots from the Suicide Squad, so some crossover there. This is the Will Smith character from the film, for anyone who needed the clue. And in one of the sequences of the series, Bane is in it, and I always enjoyed Bane, from my love of those big sort of event character replacement storylines from 90s comics. So yeah, some high quality Bane material in Secret 6 as well, if anyone finds that as big a selling point as I do.
So this is part of the wider DC Justice League shared universes.
Part of the general ongoing comics universe, yeah, it does occasionally suffer from the ongoing comics disease of referencing big storylines that were huge at the time, but now no one can really remember what they were about. Or I think there's one occasion so far where a major character is killed off in a different series and just sort of disappears. But doesn't disappear, people react to the fact that they've gone, but the thing that actually takes them out is in a different comic and it isn't included in the reprint book I'm reading. So things like that are occasionally a bit jarring, and it's possible it's the sort of thing I'm slightly more used to as a long-term comics reader. You see the footnote going, this character was murdered in Batman number 77. It's like, were they? Cool. If you really care, you might go and seek out Batman 77, but aside from that, you just sort of carry on.
I mean, that's like in a lot of TV shows when they fall out with the actor in between series and they just like write the character out. Babylon 5 being the obvious example when they change the main character between first and second series without so much as a blink of an eye.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of like, the behind-the-scenes stuff is really awkwardly reflected on TV shows, like where characters are suddenly and abruptly written out because they turned out to be arseholes or the show turned out to be arseholes. But yeah, Secret 6, if anyone fancies a sort of morally ambiguous superhero comics, it's by Gail Simone, who has a good handle on characters and jokes. It's grim, but without being completely unfun, which is a nice combination. Again, me with the dark comedy. I suspect the DC Black Friday sale will have finished by the time we release this, but if it's ever on sale again, do buy it.
First up this episode, we will be reviewing Martin Scorsese's new Netflix film, The Irishman, aka I Heard You Paint Houses. This marks Scorsese's return to the genre he defined, the gangster film, as well as reuniting him with Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, as well as his first collaboration with Al Pacino. This film follows the life of Frank Sheeran, played by De Niro, as he rises through the ranks of the mafia in post-war America. It mainly charts his relationship with legendary union boss Jimmy Hoffa, played by Al Pacino, and Hoffa's mysterious disappearance. This film was briefly in the cinemas, and then very recently released on Netflix, where we both watched it. So, Nick, what did you think of it?
Well, I imagine everyone's expecting me to say it's too long, whereas in actual fact, I didn't mind the length, although this probably helped by the fact I watched it in multiple sittings over the course of about 3 days, which may or may not have influenced the fact that I came away thinking, would this have been a better TV miniseries than a film? But having read some of his recent opinions about the death of cinema, I imagine Martin Scorsese would not be up for that. But that aside, this is a decent film. It's interesting that the guy who gave us a lot of films where the hero is sort of ambiguously awful yet cool, in the anti-hero way we've talked about many times, has now made a 3-hour epic, which honestly just makes being a mob hitman look like such a somber, life-ruining trudge. It's like, the glamour and excitement of mafia murder, it's so miserable. You want to just tell the poor guy to quit and go work in an office. Yeah, I did think it kicked in a bit more when it got to the final hour and a half, which I found a bit more resonant and emotionally rich, and the bit before that did occasionally feel a bit like a montage, but it was quite a good montage, and the film as a whole did keep my attention despite its amazing length. And the main 3 actors especially are all putting on quite strong performances despite the CGI they're communicating through. So yeah, I quite enjoyed it. It's not really my genre, to be honest, and I predictably, although I didn't mind the length, I still think it could probably have been shorter. But yeah, I was perfectly entertained. It was a pleasant gangster film. What did you think?
So I really liked it. I did think it was very good. It is very long, which is a caveat. I watched it in one sitting, but with toilet breaks.
How did you know exactly what I was about to ask?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. With toilet breaks and a brief break to put some dinner in the oven at one point, and then take dinner out of the oven. Although people don't need to know about that. But I think that the length really did work for it. I agree with you said that it really hit its stride right at the end. When you get into the bit around the disappearance of Hoffa, and then the fallout, both for the De Niro character and the broader fallout from it. That was kind of the best bit of the film. But I do feel that, although that is the best bit, you kind of have to earn it with the length that the film runs to. I mean, it really does build up in detail the De Niro character and the Hoffa character, played by Al Pacino, and their relationship. And you really get like a really detailed understanding of it. So when you get to the crux, and I'm dancing around spoilers, so we might do a spoiler bit in a bit, but when you get to the kind of the crux of their relationship, it is very powerful. And it's held by, it's played by Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, who are brilliant actors. They're still top of their game despite their age. You really do feel it, and you've earned it because you've seen 2 hours of their friendship. So when you get to the inevitable betrayal, go back to Firefly, yeah, you really do feel it, and it is kind of, it's a long walk, but it's a long walk that's worth it in the end, I feel. Although, yeah, maybe it could be cut down. I mean, there's other things, there's more I can say about it than that, but I do feel on some level it does justify the lengths more than some other very long films I've seen, even some long films that are actually shorter than we've seen recently.
Yeah, I think a lot of the length is devoted to giving us this sort of weight of the past, which presses quite heavily down on poor De Niro once you get to the final sort of sequence when present day Robert De Niro is playing the sort of older version. And I think the fact that there's the 2 hours-ish of backstory which comes first, and yes, that is a lot of backstory, that is a film worth of backstory. This is almost, if not for the fact that there's some bits, the air quotes present day sequence intercut at the beginning, it could almost be 2 movies.
Yeah.
There's a lot of backstory, and he's playing a very taciturn, quiet character. This is not a guy who emotes a huge amount. So the fact that you've seen all this weight of backstory and the way it sort of weighs down on him in the way that, as I say, it really presses down what a plodding, trudging event this mafia life actually is. And I think the length of it does play a role in that. It is a long, wearing marathon, this film. But kind of in a good way. It's one of these films where, the length definitely works in achieving the effect he's trying to portray, but I would say that one of the ways in which it does that is that, it is a bit of a wearing trudge on purpose.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's designed to be like that. I think you summed it up great when it's got it's the weight of years. You really get a sense of his friendship and how long it's gone on for and things like that, which makes it all the more powerful. I do like that there's these long dialogue scenes, especially between Pacino and De Niro, or De Niro and Joe Pesci. And there's loads of long dialogue scenes when they really get into the characters. And obviously it is just great to sit and watch these actors still at the top of their game, doing these big, meaty, almost like theatre scenes, which you don't get as much. I don't know if you ever really got in cinema to that degree, but it's a rare sight to see these big, long dialogue scenes between a small number of actors. Yeah, so it was nice to have these big, meaty scenes, which the length of the film allowed there to be so many of them. It really gave a big scope for detailed characterization.
Well, yeah, I think it's one of the ways in which the film sort of stops itself seeming slight, even though it's in the first 2 hours before it settles into one time frame for a bit. It is hopping through quite a lot of years quite quickly. You're generally getting what's realistically probably only 2 or 3 scenes maximum in a given time frame, and then probably hopping forward a few years.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which I think it makes it seem slightly more grounded is that those scenes are, as you say, quite long, and a lot of the dialogue is quite, I could say, realistic, but realistic is probably not something you can really apply to a lot of film dialogue, but it's
naturalistic, I think.
Naturalistic, sort of in some ways quite inane, but again deliberately so. It's talking about kind of nothing in a revealing way.
Yeah, there's a phenomenal sequence when they're discussing about keeping a fish in a car. If you buy a fish, how are you supposed to transport it in a car? And it is kind of just sort of funny, but also because it's a very tense scene. Again, Martin Scorsese is the master of the build-up to violence, and that scene is a long build-up to the scene that follows it. That's quite a violent scene, but the naturalistic dialogue, even though it's sort of inane, it's sort of about nothing, but it builds character and builds tension. And this is a film, it's quite a long, obviously it's quite a long film, it's quite a quiet film, it's quite a slow film, but then there's these very intense moments of violence, and they're over so quickly you don't even notice them sometimes. But it really does, the silence of the film and the slowness of the film is punctured by these extreme moments. It does make them very emotionally powerful.
I think a lot of films I've seen I haven't seen that many 3+ hour films, to be honest, but films that drift over 2.5 hours probably try and make the length work for them by, pulling out a big set piece scene or action sequence or snappy dialogue or something every few minutes to stop you nodding off. But yeah, there's very little of that here. As I say, it's very much about the sort of long hypnotic thing of it.
Yeah, and the other thing I really thought, especially Al Pacino, was really good in this film. He's playing a great character, real life character, Jimmy Hoffa, union boss, very famous political agitator in America who had disappeared. In real life, famously just sort of vanishes, and they fill in their version of what happened. I think to complete this point, I'm going to have to actually drop some spoilers. So, yeah, various spoilers, again, as per usual. If you really want to see the film, and I do recommend it, maybe here's some spoilers to skip it. But it might not be a spoiler. You maybe guess where this is going. So, spoilers begin at this point. Obviously, what happens to the Jimmy Hoffa character is he's murdered by his good friend, the De Niro character, because he's loyal to the mob above everything else, including his friend. Yeah, and it's very powerful. And I really think the story of the Hoffa character is a great one. And I've seen a lot of people saying they'd rather Martin Scorsese just did a straight Jimmy Hoffa biopic rather than this longer film bringing in all these other characters. But I think it's really interesting to see the story of Jimmy Hoffa told from the point of view of his killer is a really interesting take on the character rather than doing a straight up biopic. And it's made even better by the fact Al Pacino's great in the part. It's a great Pacino performance, worthy of his classic performances. You know, from like Heat or Scent of a Woman or The Godfather. So yeah, it's up there.
I mean, it's not. I don't know. It's not. I mean, obviously he's adapting a book, so you know, this was never, you know, Martin Scorsese going, "Who am I going to make my Jimmy Hoffa film about?" That guy. Yeah, the Al Pacino character is very good. It's a very sort of big scene-stealy part. I'm quite impressed with how much De Niro does with comparatively little, and Joe Pesci as Russell as well. They're both saying a lot without saying very much, which in a film this sort of long and often quite quiet is pretty important. And also, obviously, when they're this CGI generated, quite interesting as well.
Yeah. Also, basically saying on Joe Pesci, I think also, yeah, a phenomenal performance from Joe Pesci. Obviously, Joe Pesci's career-defining performance was in Goodfellas, also directed by Martin Scorsese. And in Goodfellas, he plays a kind of classic short man character. He's bolshy, he's loud, he's aggressive, he's violent. He's the kind of dominates every scene. And that's the kind of Joe Pesci people kind of expect. And in this film, he's the exact opposite of that. And it really does show his range as an actor. And also that, yeah, to do another gangster film with Martin Scorsese and do the exact opposite of his classic performance and it be so good as well. Yeah, it was really surprising. I did not expect to see Joe Pesci doing quiet gangster, and it really does work.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, a lot of the arc of the film is, as you said, referencing Firefly, the old sudden yet inevitable betrayal. The slow ramp up to this sort of he's got to go thing. And it's something that I think we've talked about before, the sort of slow motion tragedy, which is amazing when you pull it off and crap if you try it and don't. But yeah, the sort of fact that it obviously dawns on the audience quite a long time before the thing happens. Exactly, the bad thing is going to happen and there's nothing the characters could do to avert it, and they're just sort of pointing towards it, and you just sort of watch it slowly happen in this sort of Carvec way, and it's bad when done badly, but in something like this, when it's done well, it's really good.
Yeah.
Wow, that's an amazing point, isn't it? But yeah, it's one of these things which is always amazing to see a good version of.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But you're right in that the key is that they've taken on something that's quite challenging and built like a big sort of long-term structure around achieving this goal of like making the betrayal seem inevitable, because you know where this film is going from quite early on, but making it still like it's similar to what we were saying about the Joker, which is the weakness of the Joker is that you know where it's going, but it's not tense and it's not, you know, they don't get much drama out of it. This film, again, you know that the union boss getting involved with the mafia, this isn't going to end well, but the film really makes you feel that journey.
Oh yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, obviously, and the length of the film obviously makes it, I guess, a more impressive achievement in some ways, but, you know, dragging this sort of slow yet inevitable tragic arc over the course of 3.5 hours, it gives you a lot more space to get bored and, again, nod off. So yeah, I mean, I was not scintillatingly blown away by this film, but I think it's a very good sort of. I've watched a lot of films based on books because that is what we do a lot of the time at the moment. But yeah, this is a film based on a book. That really felt like the act of reading a book to me. I don't know why. It just felt very novelistic. I mean, the sort of first-person narration probably helped, but yeah, the sort of sprawl of it and the sort of long, slow discussions, the way it just sort of danced over this whole massive set of events, just yeah. Felt very booky.
I think also is the fact that other than the actual scenes of violence, it's not actually, weirdly, a particularly visual film. It's a film that's very heavily based on dialogue and character interaction, which, you know, I compared some of the, especially the Pacino De Niro scenes to like theatre scenes. It isn't actually a particularly filmy film. Like I say, it does feel, yeah, I totally get where you're coming at now that you said that, like, it feels like a book in that, yeah, it's like, it's got a lot of history in it, you know, it's got a lot of dialogue, it's got a lot of description done through narration. I mean, it is a film that's very heavy on narration, which is unusual for a long film because usually narration is used to make things shorter and take shortcuts. But it's interesting narration. Yeah, something I hadn't really thought of there. Yeah, it's not a particularly filmy film. It does feel more like a book or a stage play sort of combo in that it's not particularly visual, but it is still interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect Martin Scorsese would probably maybe rather this had come out via a regular movie studio and been a full-blown cinematic release, but I must admit I did not feel I'd massively missed out on any glorious sense of visual wonder by just watching this at home on my telly. Sorry, Martin. Still a good film, though.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would recommend the cinema experience is just so you have an unbroken experience of it. It would be interesting to see what it would be like just to be locked in a room with that film for 3.5 hours and you really get immersed in it. But then again, you might just discover that you just didn't pay attention to the last hour because you were desperate for the toilet, and that is like the best bit of the film. So yeah, actually, maybe it is much better to see it on Netflix.
Yeah, I'm told randomly by my partner who has not seen this film that there is a meme out there online somewhere that tells you the best places to pause or break in The Irishman.
Yeah.
As I say, I paused about an hour in and about 2.25 hours in, roughly. Watched it in roughly 3 sittings, and it did seem to break quite well at those times. I think the first break was around when they did a black and white flashback to JFK being killed, and the second break was obviously when they jumped to the present day, air quotes present day, the current non-CGI De Niro.
And when they bring in Anna Paquin as the daughter,
when they're on that sort of long drive. Yeah, those breaks did work fine. As I say, I don't necessarily know if this wouldn't have made a perfectly good sort of HBO miniseries, to be honest, but it's fine as a film.
Yeah, I think it might have been more accessible if it had come out as a 3-part Netflix show. But I guess, I respect Scorsese for sticking to his artistic vision. I just do want to say a bit about comparison to, obviously, the other great gangster films that Scorsese has done. Obviously, there's the earlier stuff like Mean Streets is a much shorter film, although, with obviously early De Niro performance. And I think I remember now, I think Harvey Keitel is also in Mean Streets, and Harvey Keitel obviously appears in this film. There's a lot of people who actually appear in this film. I guess it's quite long. Like we mentioned Anna Paquin, there's quite a few there's British actors and stuff who turn up. It's got a huge and quite interesting cast. But what's interesting is that the obvious initial point of comparison with this film is to Goodfellas, being it's another Scorsese gangster film, that time starring Ray Liotta, but also with Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci in it. It charts, again, the story of a life spent in the mafia, runs over a long period of time as well. It's also quite a long film, and this might be kind of obvious opinion, but I do think that Goodfellas is a better film. I mean, one of my sort of slightly glib comments of this film is not as Goodfellas, is I guess how I would sum up. Yeah, it's not quite as good as Goodfellas.
I have not seen Goodfellas. I'll take your word for it.
If you're dying to see one quite long Martin Scorsese gangster film, then Goodfellas is a better film. I mean, it was the one that Scorsese was supposed to win his Oscar for, but didn't, and it's a bit of a crime that he didn't. Also, Casino, the follow-up, also with De Niro, another very long, also really good gangster film. So I'm not saying that Scorsese's losing his edge, because comparing anything to Goodfellas is setting a very, very high bar. And obviously, it's the genre he defined, and it's great to see him doing gangster movies that are interesting, in depth, still doing great work with De Niro, Pesci. It's really interesting to see him finally work with Al Pacino. I mean, I really don't think they've ever worked together before. So if they have and I've missed one, do let me know. But I'm surprised it's taken this long to work together. But although this is a good film and I did like it, it's not a patch on the early 90s stuff like Goodfellas and things like that. That is where it's at, totally.
Yeah, obviously I'll have to take your word for it on the old past Scorsese comparisons. Although I will say, I believe we saw his last film, Silence, for this podcast.
Yes, we did.
And I think I preferred this to that.
Yeah, I prefer this to Silence.
Silence was an interesting film, but also I don't think it achieved its overall goals to the extent that this did. Silence felt a bit like a sort of slightly rambling indulgence project, to be honest. This felt at least like it actually had a story which it was working carefully through.
Yeah, whereas Silence was, I think, has been widely said, was a passion project for Scorsese. It's a film he'd wanted to make for a long time, and sometimes these passion projects turn out to be work of genius. Sometimes they're just, if you're too close to the subject matter, you don't produce possibly the best film. Although I've heard for a long time that Scorsese's been interested in the life of Jimmy Hoffa, and I can't think of any other director, certainly of the really big name directors, to do his story. Scorsese's the sort of person, who can get to the kind of core of that character, so I'm glad that he got to make this, and it is good. Yeah, and the CGI de-aging didn't look too uncanny. There are a few moments when De Niro, he moves like an old man. They can't get rid of that digitally de-aging, but actually it doesn't look too freakishly uncanny. It kind of works best, I think, when they make him look kind of middle-aged.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not, as we said, it's not a hugely action-packed gangster movie, which is fortunate, because I suspect it would be a lot more of a struggle if they made him do a lot of running. But, yeah, it's fine. There's a few moments where it looks a bit uncanny, yeah. Randomly, the CGI younged up Joe Pesci, I found a couple of times. It's a bit sort of you do suddenly look a bit like a puppet. But there's only a few moments throughout, and for the most part, yeah, it's fine, it's good enough, it got me through the 2 hours. Certainly, if we're talking about the terrifying future of human actors being made redundant, it looks like we're getting alarmingly close.
Yeah. As we said in our episode on Captain Marvel, when we went into this in detail, there's an enormous amount of footage out there of Robert De Niro, Al Pacino and Samuel Jackson to be fed to algorithms to digitally de-age them. I guess Joe Pesci, maybe he's just not done as many films over such a long period of time. There's just not enough data maybe to build a convincing data set to de-age him better. Maybe that's something to do with it. I mean, I think it's interesting they've chosen some of the most prolific actors of the last 30 to 40 years to digitally de-age first. People then there's a healthy amount of information about what these people look like when they were young. Also, that said, although they do a convincing job sometimes for making Robert De Niro look young, he doesn't actually look like young Robert De Niro. He doesn't look like Taxi Driver Robert De Niro when he had quite a thin face. He looks like a man with a broad face who's young, which is not what Robert De Niro looked like when he was young. I mean, he looks convincing as a young person, apart from one bit when he has to beat someone up and it doesn't look like he can quite move with the energy it needs for a fight scene.
They shot that from outside a shop, didn't they, to avoid having to show too much actual action.
Quite cleverly done, yeah. But yeah, it's weird. This looks like a new version of young De Niro. It does not look like Raging Bull De Niro or Taxi Driver De Niro or Mean Streets De Niro. So it's weird now we look like an alternative version of what De Niro might have looked like. Weirdly, if he changed less as he aged rather than more. If there's a nuclear apocalypse and these films are the only things that survive, there's going to be some very confused anthropologists in the future as to what De Niro actually looked like when he was young.
Well, yeah, I guess obviously they didn't actually create this film with a computer. De Niro actually did go in and act all these scenes, so I guess I can vaguely remember what Taxi Driver De Niro looked like, again, from when I watched it for this podcast, and I think that, I guess that would probably just been too much of a stretch. So yeah, we've got some sort of weird amalgamation. What if current De Niro and Taxi Driver De Niro had a baby? There we go.
That's basically this film. And funny enough, it worked out to be quite good.
He'd be very quiet and sad.
Next up, in this episode, we will be asking the question, what makes a good 3.5-hour film? As well as the cast and creative team behind The Irishman, one of the remarkable things about this film is that it's 3.5 hours long, as we discussed. However, there have been many great 3.5-hour films before, from The Ten Commandments to Avengers Endgame. So, what makes a good 3.5-hour film? It's clearly possible to do, but how? So, Nick, any thoughts?
Joke answer, being on Netflix so I could just watch it over 3 days.
Valid point.
Not joke answer, taking place in the past, apparently, or taking place over a vast sprawl of history. I did a tiny internet survey of films that exist that have wandered into the 3-hour region, and a lot of them do seem to tend towards this sort of sense of the epic, or taking place over a long period of time to try and really get that sense of packing in the content. I think there's a lot of historical epics. There's Lord of the Rings, I suppose, which is 3 films which are 3 hours or nearly 3 hours, or if you watch the extended versions, way over that. I guess they take place over relatively short periods of time.
As in universe time.
Yeah.
In terms of the films, they don't seem to make it very much time, but the books, the plot is supposed to take place over 5 years. It's supposed to be like a full big military campaign that takes place over quite a long period of time. Though they because people don't really age in the film, they don't really get that across as effectively as in the book, which does really convey how long the plot's supposed to take place over.
Yeah.
But the films are definitely, more of the recent examples are quite long films.
But yeah, a lot of making a good 3.5-hour film seems to be somehow creating a sense of the epic, whether that's through taking place over a long period of time or taking place over a long sort of journey that lets you do lots of long sweeping shots to show how long everything is taking. And yeah, apparently you really need to get that feeling of sweeping length in there somehow, this sort of slow crawl through plot, because if you went through plot at a normal pace of the 3.5-hour film, it would just get tiring.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I seem to have come to quite a similar conclusion, and I think I did a similar exercise, which was, try to dig through the list of films that I've seen and liked, or films I've heard of, that are long and, obviously very good. And you're right that a lot of them are historical films, or films that can capture a broad sweep of history, or someone that captures, a whole life of an individual. Again, a lot of them being historic. And weirdly, mainly ancient history or biblical history seems to be more popular for the very long films. So obvious examples are, as I said, the Ten Commandments or Ben-Hur, Spartacus. Seems to be a lot of that are biblical ancient history ones that are quite long. I guess because it seems, as is a big sweep of time, and therefore it requires this sort of epic scope in order to achieve it. And a lot of them are war films as well, actually. Yeah, like Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge on the River Kwai. Again, these are all films that are like around the 3-hour mark. Patton, Schindler's List.
I mean, maybe this comes back to Lord of the Rings. There's a certain sense of the grueling military campaign that you can maybe really get across in a really long film.
Yeah, you feel like you've been on the campaign with them.
Oh God, I really feel like I fought in this war.
Yeah.
Why did I watch this film voluntarily?
Yeah.
I'll kill you.
There's also films, I think, that are like Lord of the Rings, I think, falls into this category, but so does Lawrence of Arabia or Dr. Zhivago, which is basically what you can say about these films is everything about this film is epic. The length is epic. The scope of what they're covering is epic. Like Lord of the Rings, it's like, the battle between good and evil, the absolute good against absolute evil. And Lawrence of Arabia, it's, the battle for the future of a people and a significant chunk of the First World War. The themes are epic. The length of the film is epic. The scale it's done on is epic. Yeah, the huge battles, the huge like CGI battles in each Lord of the Rings film, like the assault on Helm's Deep or the big battle at the end of the third one. These are epic battles. Again, Lawrence of Arabia, that's before CGI. When they do the battle scenes in that is exactly 1,000 people on camel back charging into battle. That's exactly it. There's no digital effects there. So yeah, the battles are epic. The landscapes and stuff, like the landscape of Middle Earth is epic. The landscape and the way David Lean photographs it in Lawrence of Arabia is epic. Dr. Zhivago, again, it's the epic story of the Russian Revolution and the fate of a whole civilization. And there's like the emotions are epic. It's about love, betrayal, life, death, the struggle for freedom. Like these films are basically everything about this film is epic. I mean, it is the genre known as the epic. Like from scope to scale to length to themes, it's big. It's got to be big. I mean, it's that kind of film.
Yeah, I saw someone say in a review of The Irishman that this is Martin Scorsese's sprawling gangster epic, and then pause and say, "Oh, sprawling, of course, is film critic for long." Yeah, it's almost hard to define, but when you see it, and sprawling does normally mean A, between 2.5 and 3 hours long, and B, takes place over a lot of locations, a lot of characters, a lot of time, a lot of something.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine a film you could be described as sprawling that's like 2 hours long. And I've watched films that are 1.5 to 2 hours that take place in real time in one location. And although they might be long, I wouldn't describe something that took place in one location in real time as sprawling.
Yeah, if anything, that's the opposite.
Yeah. But even though it might be a similar length, there needs to be an element of bigger scope than beyond length, I think, to achieve sprawling status.
Yes, another word we need to start awarding in the most qualified way possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, weirdly, a film that I always thought was slightly odd for its length, and this wasn't quite 3 hours. And also, yes, apologies, Martin Scorsese fans, I am going to bring it back to superheroes yet again in the Martin Scorsese episode, was Aquaman, which is a film that is very long, I think about 2.5 hours, and it is, I think, plotted like a shorter film. That is, I think, one of the things that's weird about it. Now, I didn't mind Aquaman, although that is a very heavy emphasis on the didn't mind, but yeah, I think it's a film that's very sort of snappy and very sort of run and jump, and really feels like it should be shorter.
Yeah. No, actually, that's a good observed point. I mean, like, the big battle in the middle of the film, in some way, it feels like, in some films, that's kind of the point where they could be, like, wrapping it up at that point. He's got two sort of main villains, and it is quite, and it is, again, it is done quite on an epic scale. There's like, this whole under the sea kingdom that they go into, and all in fact, several kingdoms and the rivalries between them. I mean, it is getting into Lawrence of Arabia in terms of political and scope.
And yes, it never feels sprawling or epic.
No, I guess because it's so much focused on the character.
But no, because it's a superhero film which is so squarely focused on Jason Momoa, who I'm not necessarily dissing him, but I'm also not sure he has the most range in acting. But I think it always feels like quite a small film because it's just about this one bloke and his aqua experiences.
Yeah.
How it is for him to be damp.
Yeah, exactly. When you think of a film like, again, some of these David Lean films, which ones I'm leaning on a lot, it's like David Lean, like the go-to famous director for long films that are also on big scales, like, huge scenes and epic scenery and things like that. But a film like Lawrence of Arabia or Bridge on the River Kwai, even though Lawrence of Arabia is one guy's story, Bridge on the River Kwai is a story about building a bridge. It's not just about those one thing. Lawrence of Arabia is the story of the First World War. Bridge on the River Kwai is the story of the China campaign in the Second World War. And they weave all these big things into it and bring in lots of characters that represent big things and fill in big chunks of history into these films and make it less about the character, more about the big scope of the story they're telling. Again, Dr. Zhivago, he tells a story of like the Russian Revolution through a love story over a long period of time and a whole character's whole lives. Now, I'm not saying this is better.
Well, The Irishman.
No, all these, they're certainly less accessible than Aquaman, and for many people, a lot less entertaining. And there's nothing wrong with being entertaining. It's a different approach, but I think that's what makes a David Lean film is, if you look at sprawling film in the dictionary, you get a picture of David Lean and then a long shot of Lawrence of Arabia and the desert underneath. But that's what makes it different to Aquaman. As you say, Aquaman is about Aquaman, whereas Lawrence of Arabia is not about Lawrence of Arabia. It's about the whole, sort of Middle Eastern campaign of the First World War.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about, the level of sprawl in superhero films, there's always the obvious, example of good old Avengers Endgame, a film which I think just about carries it off, just on volume of characters, and the time travel thing, I think, does actually kind of help.
It doesn't feel as long as it is.
It doesn't, and I think it does have just about enough scale and scope. Like, I don't have to dick around with spoilers for Avengers Endgame at this stage, do I? There's a time jump in Avengers Endgame, obviously, towards the beginning, where it jumps forward in time after their failed attempt to stop Thanos. And it's a small bit, but I think it goes a long way towards making it feel like it warrants the 3 hours. It goes a long way to make it feel like we're not just having a bit of a fight, go to somewhere else and a fight, oh look, time for the big final fight. It does do a lot to create the sense that this is something substantial that has happened.
It's set in its own world within the Avengers universe, and the world of what it would be like after a year or so of living in the post-Thanos extinction environment. Like, the fact it's got its own world and gives it this scope that, like, it's digging into the whole history of its own world. There's something about it having that and then setting over, like, again, with a time jump, makes the scope bigger. Being epic is more than just being long. It's having this big scope, which Avengers have. Another one, I think that, and it is long for a Marvel film, although I'm pretty sure it's way short, 3 hours, is Black Panther. Again, it feels like it's got this big scope because Black Panther, for me, has more in common with Lawrence of Arabia than it does with Aquaman. This is not also some hackneyed attempt to put Black Panther on the same level as David Lean and Aquaman on some lower level. I try not to hierarchy films. Films are good in different ways. But I do feel that, like, Black Panther is the story of Wakanda. It's not just the story of Black Panther. It's the story of Wakanda told through the character of Black Panther. But just as Lawrence of Arabia is the story of the Middle Eastern front of the First World War told through one character's experience of it. Whereas Aquaman is the story of Aquaman. And Black Panther feels like it's more epic in scope and scale.
Yes, I would agree with yes. Aquaman does feel like, the less good Black Panther. In a similar way, but although 4 has its charms that obviously they've really started to fully realise in the last film. I think, again, the problem is that it feels like it's 4's story, and Asgard is mostly just a cardboard backdrop to that story.
Yes, it feels very much like that.
Another film that I've only just remembered is about 3 hours long, and yes, still superheroes, so is The Dark Knight Rises, which is a weird one.
Again, does feel like it has an epic scope as well as epic length, in that it brings a lot of characters. And again, Batman is famously, you are telling the story of Gotham through the fact that it's such a strange place and it needs a man in a mask dressed as a bat to make it safe. You're telling the story of an odd place, not just one man and his struggle with his demons.
The length of Dark Knight Rises always, to me, ends up symbolising the sheer scale to which that film just went weird. Like, if that film was a bit shorter, maybe it would have had to be a slightly more regular superhero film. But instead, every half hour or so, it takes another jump into sort of, so now it's the city's been evacuated and the Scarecrow is a judge. Cool.
And also he's in a prison underground somewhere in the Middle
Batman's
East.
in a pit, just like in the classic Batman stories. Yeah, I mean, it's just endearing. I mean, I'm not sure that film entirely works. In fact, there are people who say, look, you're too kind to that film, it's flat out bad. And I'm not sure I can even entirely argue with them. But it's one of these weird times where it's got all this, it almost feels like it started out with the time and then just sort of expanded into it in a sort of increasingly strange way.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think what Dark Knight Rises reminds me of is Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. It's basically the point when the editor could no longer stand up to the creative based on the fact that they'd achieved enormous success with their previous work. Now, no one's denying that either Christopher Nolan or J.K. Rowling had achieved enormous success with their previous work. That doesn't mean the editor is wrong to say this is too much. You need to rein it in a bit.
I mean, although Order of the Phoenix is a comically enjoyable example of it, obviously J.K. Rowling is not the first person in the world to have a big success and use it to produce a monument to her own self-indulgence.
Ironically, just to divert into discussing J.K. Rowling, my partner's just finished reading the new Robert Galbraith, and basically they've got back to the point where the editor can't stand up to Rowling anymore. Anyway, dragging it back to long films, something that I know a lot more about is that, I mean, recently in this podcast, I was discussing Apocalypse Now, and I stand by saying one of my absolute favourite films of all time. And the Redux version is brilliant, and it really justifies, I think, that 3 hours and 40-minute length. Because, again, it's trying to tell the story of the whole Vietnam conflict, and as well as telling also the story of kind of Dante's Inferno and just this descent into madness story. And like the Redux version, well, the final cut, which we discussed in this podcast, is the best version of the film. But it's got all the stuff in, like, for example, it's got the scene when they stumble over the French plantation, which fills in more of the history of Vietnam. It goes beyond the American experience in Vietnam, and it hints at, it talks about even not only about the French colonial adventures in Vietnam, but links it back to the war between the Vietnamese and the Chinese before that. So especially the longer versions of Apocalypse Now really do fill in the whole history of the Vietnam conflict, not just a tiny bit on the end where America was involved. And yeah, again, but also it's epic in scope and scale. They've got the whole, large chunks of the Filipino military in just to film it because they needed that many helicopters. And yeah, again, a film I saw recently in the cinema. And again, it's a mere 3 hours, the Apocalypse Now final cut. But in the cinema, it was like this, I was phenomenal experience and totally blown away. And the length and the depth of getting into it made it work. So there's something about that scope and scale, and also having that vision as a director, I think, like Scorsese has, or like David Lean has, or like Francis Ford Coppola has for Apocalypse Now, and also for his other 3.5-hour film, which also starred Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, Godfather Part 2. Having that strength of vision as a director, I think, makes a great, really long film.
And yeah, again, at the sort of other end of the spectrum, I, whilst Googling my research for this, was suddenly struck by my memories of the Hobbit trilogy, which is a weird example of something which was just hobbled by how obviously not epic and not sprawling it is compared to its own direct predecessor. Like, the idea of three-hour films telling the story of Lord of the Rings, like, yes, epic, sprawling, that is the right thing to do. And now we're going to make almost 3-hour films telling the story of The Hobbit. Oh God, are you?
Yeah, no, I didn't even see the third one. I was so disappointed with the first two.
I did not see any of them because I was so disappointed by the entire concept.
Well, you made the right decision there. But, I mean, again, it's like Lord of the Rings is the story of Middle-earth. I know there's a lot of stuff before it, like Silmarillion and things like that, but Lord of the Rings, in a nutshell, is the story of Middle-earth. Whereas The Hobbit is the story of that group of people and that adventure. And don't get me wrong, it's a great story. One of my absolute favourite books as a kid. One of the very, early works of fantasy that I really got into and absolutely loved as a kid. But it's a story of a group of people on an adventure, as many, many great stories are. It is not the story of an entire universe, and it does not justify three-hour films. Lord of the Rings does, because Lord of the Rings is not the story of just people on an adventure. It's the story of an entire world. That's the difference between the two, and that's why one worked and one didn't.
Yeah, and there's levels of epic sprawl as well. Like, if they've made a single, 2.5, 3-hour film of The Hobbit, and they've done it well, people probably would have been going, yes, epic and sprawling, it works, because it's the right level of epic and sprawling for that story. Maybe.
Yeah, I agree with that.
A bit of a failure of matching story to material there.
It's also an interesting subnote to say that the idea that a film should be an hour and a half to 2 hours is actually quite a Western concept. It's interesting that 3.5 hours is about average for a Bollywood film.
Don't they have intervals?
They do have intervals. And also, actually, one thing that when I was looking at this list, I realised most of these epic long films that I've got on my list of great 3-hour plus films, a lot of them are from the 50s and 60s, and a lot of them had intervals. Like on my list, like Gandhi, Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, I think Lawrence of Arabia had an interval. The ones from the 70s, like Apocalypse Now, didn't. Obviously, more recent ones, there's been some great, more recent, longer stuff, like obviously Avengers. Titanic, it's pretty good, long film. Schindler's List, Dances with Wolves. There are a handful out there, but a lot of them were older and thus back from the days when people had intermissions. So Gandhi has intermission, Ten Commandments intermission, Spartacus has an intermission. Bollywood films, go for intermissions, but a Bollywood film is more like going to see like a play or a musical in the West End when you expect a whole evening's entertainment, which again with an intermission. But like a stage musical like Hamilton, the soundtrack by itself is just like about 2.5 hours. The play is longer because there's extra bits in it, but average Bollywood films clock in easily 3.5 hours, but you do get a toilet break, which helps.
Yeah, I don't know if whether Hollywood films have gravitated towards the sort of hour and a half, 2 hour mark because that's somehow their natural length in the same way that pop songs should apparently be 3.5 minutes, or whether it's just driven by, the capitalistic desire to get more than one show in the average evening.
Yeah, but you always think that, like, where apparently cinemas and stuff make their money is all in the popcorn and hot dogs and soft drinks and that. So you think it would make sense to give people a break in the film so they could refill. But yeah, you're probably right. It is about trying to get more screenings into an evening.
I might be wrong, but I assume a whole new set of people will probably get more snacks. But I don't know, because I try and avoid buying cinema snacks because I'm tight.
Yeah, although it's weird, like how is like when you think about it, the greatest artistic works of the recent generations are mainly just vehicles for selling popcorn, literally popcorn, and overpriced giant tubs of Coca-Cola. Cynicism aside, occasionally I do like a good 3 hour film. JFK, that's 3 hours, that's quite good.
I imagine for the exact reason I just said, the 3.5 hour film probably doesn't shift that much popcorn and Coca-Cola, does it? Because it eats like the entire evening.
That's a good point.
I mean, especially with the horrendous cinema ads, that's get there at 7 o'clock, you're not getting out till, counts on his fingers, 11 o'clock. You get there at 8 o'clock and you're there till midnight.
Yeah. Again, also, when discussing this segment earlier with my partner, she said that she did find Avengers Endgame a somewhat stressful experience because you have to think about what you eat and drink beforehand so you don't fall asleep or desperately need the toilet because you want to be fully cognizant for the full 3 hour glory. I mean, it does add an extra layer of pressure, especially when you know there's not going to be an intermission. So
yeah, I've probably done this anecdote before on the podcast, but yeah, the last 45 minutes, hour of Infinity War was somewhat ruined for me by an unwise second drink before going in, which did lead to me having to spend the last 45 minutes or so bouncing in my seat, waiting to go to the toilet, and then running to and from the toilet in the time between the second and third end credit scene.
Yeah. If they're going to do long films and film lengths are creeping longer, I do think one of the things is also worth pointing out, it's harder to be good for long. I mean, it applies to books and albums as well. Quality is hard to achieve. It's one of the reasons why we prefer things that are better. It's more of an achievement. And more quality over a longer period of time is harder still. I mean, that's just kind of how it works. So, but if you're going to make longer films, that's going to be more difficult. But if Hollywood, as it seems to, I guess as they had tried to, through an endless desire to adapt everything ever, and we're digging into more books, comic arcs, and TV series that are longer in scope and trying to push them down to films, that's making films longer. If you're going to insist on long films, then maybe consider resurrecting the intermission, because it does help with those of us who have had a pint before going to the cinema. Apologies.
What makes a good 3.5 hour film? A break in the middle. It's rare that we actually answer the question so clearly.
David Lean knew that, and he is the master of the epic.
That was a man who knew he needed to piss.
I can't follow that up.
Okay, and thanks very much for listening. I don't know how long this podcast is going to be, but probably less than 3.5 hours. We already recorded an hour and 20 minutes-ish, so you'd hope so, wouldn't you? And if you made it through that, we'll be back in 2 weeks. But if you get bored before then, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com and read all the latest HOTS-related content, including, I believe, an essay from Alistair about Alien to go with his recommendation from earlier. And then if you enjoy all of the things we do, you can also go to your podcatcher of choice and leave us a nice review. Please do. It's nearly Christmas.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast, or you can find us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can also find out more from me by going to my website, which is redtrainblog.com, or following me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball.
Yep, I've been Nick Bryan. You can find out more about me by going to nickbryan.com. That's Bryan with a Y. Have I mentioned that before this podcast? Who knows? And or going to nickmb on Twitter. Thank you very much. And while I'm talking about myself, brief personal schedule note, I'm afraid I'm moving house towards the end of December and therefore have quite a lot of exciting life admin on, which may lead to some delays or irregularities with the release of this podcast. I can only apologise in advance. I don't even know if this episode's going to go up on time, I just sort of hope so. I'm pretty sure we'll still get the right amount of episodes out broadly. They just may not go out every other Thursday like clockwork with the regularity you're used to. So again, apologies if that does go a little bit off the rails. Everything should be back to normal by probably mid to late January at worst. Thank you. And with that, we'll be back in probably about 2 weeks, give or take my packing needs, with our next episode covering the new movie Jumanji: The Next Level. See you there. Bye.
Bye. Oxide Ghost probably would be a bigger hit and more well known if he was an easier film to get hold of. He decided to protect his artistic art.
His artistic integrity.
Yeah, well, we've always got to protect our arse integrity as much as possible.
And our arse and the ticks upon it.
Yeah.